Welcome to the Ecomodernist channel live. I'm Carl Pauls. I'm joined by Gabe Ignetti. Gabe, why don't you introduce this? It's a video that you put together.
Yes, there was a segment on NBC that was just plain horrible. The whole point of it, without them actually saying it, but they implied it in a gazillion ways, is that we got to shut down Turkey Point. It's too dangerous. It's too environmentally damaging. So I put together this synopsis, and it's very much involved with Miami waterkeepers who don't want to see the extension of the Turkey Point license extended to a total of 80 years. And they're concerned about the heat in the water. They're concerned about sea level rise. They're concerned about embrittlement. And by the way, I asked Dr. Rachel Silverstein, who's an oceanographer and marine biologist, to be a guest on our show. I sent that way back when.
Yeah, here's Dr. Silverstein and her background.
I'll send another one. We're going to send this entire video out to all the Florida Facebook groups. We really want to have a campaign to get Rachel on. And we're not here to slam Miss Silverstein. We want to have a real conversation. We are environmentalists as well. I'm talking directly to Miss Silverstein, by the way, who I hope will see this thing. And I'm talking to my friends in Florida. I'm not speaking as no shill. I am a former board member of the Green Party of Miami, a former board member and vice president of the Miami-Dade 350 chapter for several years. And I'm still on the board, by the way. I'm a former labor leader. I can be very anti-corporate. And this is not about corporations. Just to give you a little of my background, I think it's important that you know that I'm not some kind of talking head here trying to sell you a bill of goods. You can't do this. If there's problems, Ms. Silverstein, if you're out there, or tell Ms. Silverstein, let's talk about it. Come on our show. Problems can be fixed. But once you get rid of a nuclear power plant, talking about the whole South Florida region, you're getting rid of most of the electricity that's clean there, and you're going to replace it with renewables, they say. And as a South Floridian, I'll tell you something. We have a rainy season, and we have no wind in Florida, okay? So I've had periods of 10 days even where there's hardly any sun that I've went through, and periods of a week without any sun hardly is common. And you can't get through that with batteries. I mean, batteries can't keep the electricity running in any metropolitan area for one night, let alone 1 week. So it's ridiculous. And we got hurricanes down here. Hurricane Maria hit Puerto Rico a couple of years ago, and it demolished both their wind and their solar power that they had down there. It's exposed to the weather. Nuclear power plant, on the other hand, has a 5-foot thick wall that hurricane is hitting against. And that is the biggest danger, because we are in a very hot place. And if the power goes off because your renewables just got demolished, people are going to die from heat stroke. And they're talking about the same thing about extensions going to in St. Lucie and other areas too. Once you get rid of this, you're moving backwards. And instead of moving forward in a climate emergency, you're playing catch up. And that's something that we cannot afford to do in a climate emergency. So we're concerned about the environment and the ocean just as she is, and ocean acidification, which is caused by all the CO2 that Turkey Point prevents from going into the atmosphere. It's imperative that we have this clean source. And where do we go from here as far as Turkey Point to keep it going for the next 20 years? So with that, let's start.
Back now with our NBC News investigation into growing concerns about the nation's aging nuclear power plants. Are they prepared for the ravages of climate change and for natural disasters like the recent Hurricane Ian? Cynthia McFadden with an alarming wake-up call.
Tonight, the looming question. What if Hurricane Ian had moved 150 miles east and struck Miami? Might its 50-year-old nuclear power plant, Turkey Point, have ended up endangering the community it serves?
So the first point is that Turkey Point is 50 years old, and Hurricane Ian could have moved further south and damaged the Turkey Point plant. Is this something that happens very often in Florida? It seems like you've had a few hurricanes over that 50-year lifespan, and in fact, it does regularly get hit by hurricane force winds. Is that true? Or are you just lucky this whole time?
No, actually, Turkey Point already got hit by a storm. I believe that was every bit as bad, maybe worse. That was Hurricane Andrew. And nothing happened. I mean, if an airline shot into it, the airline would be incinerated with only cosmetic damage to the reactor. And they're 20 feet above sea level.
I'm going to go ahead and restart.
The community serves.
You can't operate a nuclear plant if it's an island in the middle of a storm.
That doesn't sound true to me. I know that, for example, we operate nuclear plants underwater all the time in our submarine fleet. A little bit of a joke. I know that our plant in South Carolina basically had all entrances and exits cut off at one point, and they called it an anomalous event because this is something that we need to be careful about when a plant is isolated in that way. It'll be hard for a work shift to depart and arrive, but that plant can continue to operate and operate safely. It's simply an anomaly in the operation. You need to be aware of the changing conditions of a plant when it is isolated like that. So, unfortunately, Dr. Silverstein's not correct here. You can absolutely operate a nuclear plant through anomalies like having their entrances and exits cut off. You prefer not to, but it is possible, and in fact, they can operate safely and help the recovery of the region. I'm going to start it.
Local environmentalist Rachel Silverstein, a marine biologist, fears Turkey Point is not ready and has challenged the plant's license.
We're very concerned that Turkey Point is cutting corners and is not doing all of the assessments that it needs to do to run this plant into the future safely.
This is sort of part of the legal challenge against Turkey Point that Riverkeeper and I think several other anti-nuclear organizations have launched. So it's basically asking, should we change the status quo? And here the question is, should we shut down a nuclear plant and replace it with gas? Are we actually replacing it with something? So that's sort of my question. And if you're, working on this case, you absolutely need to pose that question. This is asking for the status quo of fossil fuels to dominate instead. Because they're so dependent on backup systems, renewables tend to offer a marginal improvement, whereas highly available system like 90% available nuclear completely drives fossil fuels off the grid.
I'm glad you mentioned that, Carl. Let's get real here. It's impossible to build any kind of large industrial installation without environmental impacts. The cost, the time, the problems with replacing Turkey Point with renewables are enormous. Let's not kid ourselves. These are massive industrial installations. And how massive are they? Well, a 1 gigawatt nuclear power plant requires 1.3 miles of land. The solar equivalent of that would require between 45 and 75 square miles. So we need to ask ourselves, what kind of environmental impact do you get? And wind is even worse. The equivalent wind farm would require between 260 and 360 square miles of land. This is a tremendous amount of ecological damage. What could go wrong? And we're talking about 12 miles out at sea, because that's where the wind is. And the diagram here is at sea level. According to the World Bank, an offshore wind farm takes anywhere between 5 and 10 years to develop. that is every bit as long. That is the two AP1000 reactors that FPL is planning on building, with one vastly important difference: reliability. Offshore wind faces the same old problems that confronted sailors for centuries: calm seas. It was widely reported that just last year, Britain had gone through 9 days without wind power. And it's a very common problem because wind is often blowing either too hard or not enough. And I'm not saying this to slam renewables. We need every weapon in our arsenal. I've spent the better part of my life fighting for renewables, including campaigning against FPNL vigorously in support of solar energy. I'm simply saying that there's a reason that nuclear power is so much more energy dense than everything else. E equals mc squared, which basically means that an extremely minuscule amount of matter can be turned into a monumentally massive amount of energy. That enormously high energy density translates into the lowest ecological footprint in terms of land use, materials, and waste.
I'm going to start it.
She points to a plant in Fukushima, Japan, hit by an earthquake and tsunami that left 120 square miles of land that may well be uninhabitable for generations.
So here's the Fukushima Daiichi complex. The area of the complex, which is definitely not going to be usable, as it'll be a brownfield industrial site for a very long time. It's not a statement of fact to say that the area is uninhabitable. That's actually quite false.
So let's talk about Fukushima. Dr. Geraldine Thomas of the Imperial College of London is a leading British expert on radiation. She has visited Japan many times as an advisor, and she has stated that it is our fearful response to radiation that has endangered lives, that the exclusion zone is not really dangerous, and there are plenty of places in the world where we could live with background radiation of at least that level. One leading example is Ramsar, Iran, which compared to the radiation levels of 50 millisieverts in the exclusion zone, has a background radiation readings of 260 millisieverts, over 5 times as much. And studies have shown no significant difference between the health outcomes of the people there and in other places. The fact of the matter is that there was 0 recorded radiation fatalities from Fukushima. So we need to ask ourselves, if Fukushima was such a long-lasting health catastrophe, how is it that 4 years later, Japan broke its own record for longevity? Japan continues to remain the perennial world leader in spite of having experienced 2 atomic bombings and 3 nuclear meltdowns. And I'm not saying that Fukushima is not a tragedy. It is one of many energy-related disasters that have all caused too many illnesses, misery, and death. But we need energy to survive, and it is imperative that that energy be clean. But the good news is that you have far more greater chance of dying from climbing up the stairs or walking down the street than being killed in a nuclear accident anywhere in the world. And nuclear power is becoming even safer. Nuclear power is actually one of the safest forms of energy production per kilowatt hour, based on worldwide fatality data. I might add that a study by Dr. James Hansen reveals that 1.8 million lives have been saved by atomic energy and may save up to 7 million more. But anyhow, go ahead, Carl.
While its nuclear reactors are elevated about 18 feet above sea level, the massive cooling system, highlighted in green, essential for maintaining the nuclear core, is not.
Waterkeepers is talking about its sea level rises. They're afraid of not of the current, but of future sea level rise. And the IPCC, I believe it's by 2050, it's 1 foot of sea level rise. And 2050 is like 10 years past when that 80-year span. And 1 foot, that's all. And I mean, even if it's 2 feet, double that, 3 feet, I mean, no. And if that whole Antarctic West Arctic and ice sheet goes, you got a bigger problem with Miami being underwater completely than you have with that plant, which will probably all right anyhow.
This is basically sea level. So what's the risk here if this cooling pond is flooded? Does that mean there's no water available to cool the reactor? No, it absolutely doesn't mean that. It means that your spray pond, and that's what these are spray ponds that they use to evaporate the water, those become inundated with ocean water. It's probably a very, very small tritium problem, if that. I don't know. It's just a tiny amount of tritium left in the spray pond at this point, if any. But
which is not dangerous at all.
Yeah, it's absolutely not dangerous at this extremely low level.
At all. You could drink it.
yeah. Even if all of the tritium in the reactor were taken out, you would not feel an effect from that. Other radioisotopes, yes, you absolutely would. But the plant itself is not dependent on that water to keep the reactors cool. Yeah. Okay, I'm going to resume.
Another concern, there's about 1,500 metric tons of radioactive waste stored right here next to the bay.
So the next fear-mongering and really, really fear-mongering point is the tons and tons of radioactive waste, which is encased in concrete and steel casks. An airstrike to this would not do a thing. It would take basically a very, very strong high ordnance or nuclear blast to cause a problem here. And while they are strong, hurricanes are not nuclear blasts. Nuclear blasts are focused impacts, and that hurricane's not going to do a thing to this nuclear waste, and it hasn't in over 50 years.
They could withstand a freight train, again, with hit directly with just cosmetic damage, and you can see the video of that on YouTube from the Department of Energy would actually do it.
Okay, resuming.
But for 4 decades, the Energy Department has failed to find a place to put radioactive waste, impacting power plants in 33 states.
So here is the next bit of an untruth, is that we don't know what to do with nuclear waste. And that's, of course, false. We did designate a geological repository that was blocked politically. It doesn't have any basis in science. It in fact is a scare tactic. And of course we know what to do with nuclear waste. It is not a volatile, extremely dangerous substance. It is a slightly risky substance that if we leave it alone where it is in concrete casks, it will be fine for hundreds of years. If we just commit to a solution, we have a solution. The only blockade is political.
Moving could I say something too about that? Yeah, I got to give a pitch to Friends of Fission, who did a fantastic video, and it's called "What About the Waste" with Dr. James Conca, who's a leading expert on this. And he mentions that there is 16 square miles in Texas. It's a salt deposit. He says that they estimated that you could put all the waste in the world in there for 1 billion years, 1 billion years, with no danger to anybody at all, because it's going to stay in that salt, and that's it. You know, like everything is radioactive around us. We're radioactive. I mean, let's get that out of the way. But how much radioactivity is actually safe? Nobody talks about that, and he did. He said that in 250 years, the spent fuel is so harmless at that point to humans that you could put it in your hand safely and nothing will happen to you. So, sure, it's radioactive for 1 million years or something, but what's it turn into? Lead, I think, which it becomes shielding. You know, it's a ridiculous statement, you know, this whole thing. But anyhow.
Well, I want to thank you all for this quick program. I think that we've covered just about everything.
Please subscribe to us on YouTube, Ecomodernist channel. Also to subscribe to us on Twitter and Facebook, Ecomodernist Society of North America.
And online at https://esna.earth.